Welcome to Question Mark, the podcast, exploring the greatest story ever told with open minds and open hearts.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.
Well, hello and welcome yet again to Question Mark, a fortnightly podcast about Mark's Gospel, the greatest story ever told. Thank you so much for joining us today. Do tell your friends if you like it, and tell us what we could do better if you don't. My name, as you probably know by now, is David Payne. I'll be your host for this, which is the 60th episode in our journey through this intriguing book. Today, we're delighted to have John Burnett with us once again. John, you've been on I've been on two podcasts with you before, but I think you've actually been on 6 altogether, which there is some kind of record for that. It should be a prize, more than any other guests. And you've been very much, I know, behind the scenes for the whole series, really. So thank you for your input. And I wonder whether you could tell us a bit about the Gospel of Mark workshop you run. I know a little bit about it. So you created it to teach African students about the structure and the story of the book. And you run it in different contexts. But I wonder, could you tell us what it looks like and who it's designed for in the short time we've got?
Sure. I've put on the screen the Gospel of Mark workshop. And sorry, there's a mistake here. So let me fix it. And there you are. So it's gospelofmarkworkshop.com, which emerged out of my my experience of teaching the Gospel of Mark in Africa to Africans who were totally without context, Western context. And I realized that this is probably true of most of us Westerners anyway. So I put together this workshop in which I go through the Gospel of Mark in the way that I do. You'll get a sample of that today, to try to be helpful to get people to understand what the story in Mark is, what I call it Mark's poem about Jesus. And so you can go on the website, which has not been updated for a long time, so forgive me, it's just a lot of work. But anyway, you can contact me through there if you're interested, and we can talk about doing another session of the workshop. I am hoping to actually start recording it very soon. And as far as payment of that goes, I don't actually accept any payment. What I ask people to do is contribute to the Africa Fund, in which I support education, food, health, and basically life. For a lot of the poorest people in the world, in Congo and in Uganda. And so we support about 60 people, and you can go to stnicholasafricafund.org, and right there on the middle of the page, you'll find a donate button. And whether you take the workshop or not, please donate liberally.
Give us your money. Fantastic. No, that's really great. Thank you for telling us about that. And for our listeners on Spotify or Apple Music, there is going to be a slide in a minute. So if you want to hop over to the other side and watch this on YouTube, you get to see our faces as well. But you will get to see John's structure of how Mark's Gospel is organized. Anyway, moving on. Steph, only got 8 more questions to make up. Got 8 more episodes after this.
Yeah.
Different.
Anyway, I believe in you, David.
Here's today. Okay. I wonder what your experience has been of John's workshop with your teacher in front of you, and maybe what's been the biggest changes to your thinking about Mark's Gospel as a result of taking it.
Okay, I'm going to try and avoid exaggeration, but I would say that John has been one of the most influential people in my life. And the reason for that is I thought before I met John that I knew what Mark's Gospel was about. I thought I knew how to read it, but the more I look at it with John's help, the more I see it's an entirely different piece of writing. It's not purely factual, not a historical account, as I more or less thought. It actually has a depth of theology, and John's used that word poetry as well, which I think is a fantastic word, actually. Describes a piece of literature as much as it describes a story. And Mark is it's beautifully written, beautifully crafted. I'm hoping we'll sample that today. And indeed, the podcast has been built very much on my conversations with John over the last couple of years.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. We should get on, really, shouldn't we, and talk about it, this wonderful gospel. As usual, Lucy Warner is going to read through this quite extraordinary passage, actually, before we start the discussion. So over to you, Lucy.
Mark chapter 14, verses 53 to 65, New International Version. Jesus before the Sanhedrin. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, "I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another, not made with hands." Yet even then their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophecy!" And the guards took him and beat him.
Well, thank you, Lucy. Now we're going to look at the passage in 4 sections, and I know John's got a structure he wants to introduce as well. So it's going to be, the first section is introducing the chief priests and the teachers and Peter. The second section is quite long, where Jesus is being accused, falsely accused, and they can't get their act together. The third section is Jesus's great answer, where he says, "I am." Excuse the spoiler there. And the fourth section is the very end, when after he's been accused of all those things. So we'll try and stick to that, but I'm sure we'll circle around a little bit. So John, do you want to just, having given a structure, just explain this passage within the context of how you see it?
All right, I'm going to share my screen here. Now, if you are able to see this, I have outlined here the entire Passion narrative from chapter 14, well, chapters 14, 15, and 16. And it has a rather intricate structure, intricate and simple at the same time. It begins with a woman anointing Jesus' body for burial, and it ends with the women observing Jesus' burial and coming to anoint his body. So those are like bookends. And then in between those two bookends, you have 3 major sections. One of them is centered on the Eucharist, the Last Supper. The bread is my body, which is given for you, and the cup is my blood of the covenant. And that section begins with Judas offering to hand over Jesus to the authorities, and ends with Judas handing Jesus over to the authorities. And then the last section, it begins with Pilate, and it ends with the centurion. And Pilate is asking, "Are you king of the Jews?" And the centurion says, "Truly, this guy was God's son." And the middle of that section is the actual crucifixion. The part we're looking at today is the second of these 3 major sections, or I could say the middle one of these 3 major sections, which are arranged kind of like an A-B-A structure. So we're looking at what I call section B, and it starts with Jesus taken to the high priest, and it ends with Jesus being taken to Pilate. Right after Jesus is taken to the high priest, then the leaders assemble. right before Jesus is taken to Pilate, the leaders assemble. Peter follows at a distance, and then Peter denies Jesus kind of on the other side of that. And Peter is with the attendants by the light, which is an interesting expression. And then just before Peter's denial, the attendants receive Jesus and start to rough him up. After that, I'm moving in towards the center here. The council members and false witnesses bear the testimony, and then the council members and the false witnesses, after Jesus' final statement at the trial, they begin to spit on him and so forth. And then as we're now approaching the middle of this section, you have the high priest is questioning Jesus, and then afterwards the high priest asks for the verdict. And then in the very middle of this section, you have Jesus speaking for the first time and revealing himself as the Lord and as the Son of Man, coming as at the right hand of power and coming in glory. So what we see is this statement of Jesus to the high priest is the center of the entire passion narrative. And so what is Jesus up to in the center of the entire passion narrative? In other words, what is the focus of the entire passion narrative? It is not the crucifixion. That's kind of a denouement, results and everything like that. But the center, as far as Mark's story goes, as far as Mark's interest goes in telling the story, the center is to show you who is Jesus and to show you in some ways very clearly. Now, as it turns out, of course, the center here, Jesus saying, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting and coming." The center here is tied to a whole lot of other stuff in the gospel, and we'll do our best to explore this somewhat as we can as we go. But I want you to have the idea that that there is a structure to the passion narrative. It's not simply a sort of a historical account and sort of blow by blow, and this is what happened, but that actually Mark has organized this in a very strict way. So that if you contemplate it as he wrote it, you will focus in increasingly on who Jesus is. And that's a question that's been with us ever since actually the first verse, the beginning of the good news of Jesus, the Messiah,
yes,
God's Son. So Messiah, God's Son, is who Jesus is. And then at the baptism, you are my Son, the beloved, in whom I'm well pleased. And then who is this whom even the winds and the seas obey? Well, who do you think? And then this is my beloved Son. Listen to him at the Transfiguration. And so and then who do people say I am? And Peter says, and this will be important in this passage, Peter says, you're the Messiah. So, okay.
brilliant.
John,
sharing. Say what?
If you haven't got YouTube, I'd strongly suggest you have a look. If you're not on YouTube, have a look at that, because that's a really clear presentation of how that structure works.
I think for me, going back to your first question for me, David, what John's just shared with us really underlines the point. If nothing else, and John's obviously going to talk at great length in a moment about the significance of that center of the center. Yes. But for me, seeing that Mark's gospel has a structure, yes, it actually has been tightly wrought. It's not just been written down slapdash, as some people used to argue that it was like a rough piece of work that wasn't really structured, just very loose. It's nothing of the kind. And I think that really underlines the point that Mark is up to something significant. It's something is really thought through, carefully articulated.
Yeah, that's very clear from the picture.
Yeah.
Let me ask why in this very first section where we're introducing the characters, if you like, why is Mark at such pains to itemize and include all the leaders of the Jewish nation as aggressors? And then when Mark repeatedly says all, does he mean all? If we want to talk about Peter as well, he gets a mention, doesn't he? That he hadn't run away completely. He actually turns up. John, what does all mean all?
Well, there's two alls here. There's all the disciples who run away, and Peter, runs away, but then he kind of comes behind and sneaks in. As far as assembling all of the chief priests and the leaders and the Pharisees and so forth, what that is all the Sanhedrin. Some people say Sanhedrin, but I was taught Sanhedrin. So it's the entire Jewish council. In other words, this is like the entire government is gathered. So the leadership of the nation, and Mark is kind of at pains in the first verse there, and in the rest of the episode, to underscore the lawlessness of the leadership, and he wants you to know that it's not just some of the leaders, but all of the leaders are unanimously organized against the Lord and against His anointed, as it says in Psalm 2. The Lord said to my Lord, no, so that's Psalm 110. Why do the nations rage and the peoples utter folly? Anyway,
this bit about all though is for some people quite a tense aspect of the passage that we're studying, because for some, am I right in thinking it's almost been taken as a criticism of the Jewish nation, that the Jews, all the Jewish authorities, the fact that Mark seems to underline the fact that every single one of the Sanhedrin were against Jesus, has, for some, unfortunately, in the course of history, underlined that anti-Semitism, which is so sadly has dominated the landscape over the last couple of centuries.
Well, I suppose you can use it that way, but the thing is, you got to remember, Mark is a Jew.
Yeah,
and he's writing largely for Jews. So this is a criticism of our people. It would be like me criticizing the United States Supreme Court. I am free to do that. You're free to do that. But I mean, more free to do that because I am a subject of their lawlessness. So like that, right?
Yeah, sure.
Let's move on a little bit, shall we? Into the next section. Why do we think Mark emphasizes Jesus's innocence? That no two witnesses could agree, and they needed to for the law, didn't they? The falseness of the charges against him. Is it to contrast the priests breaking their own rules, or is there a more significant purpose in view? Steph, all right.
Sure.
Well, I think before we get to that, I would like to notice that we have, and if you look at my outline, you'll see this, we have Peter is following behind. And so, we go from bringing Jesus to the high priest, and then we have the high priest assemble, and now we have Peter, and Peter is with the attendants. Some translations say guards, but the word isn't exactly guards. It's more like attendants or something like that. And Peter is warming himself. Usually translations say by the fire, but it's interesting in Greek. It says he's warming himself by the light, and that's always seemed to me to be a very kind of suggestive, statement, right? Peter's warming by the light, and but it's not really the light anyway. But that would maybe lead us into more Johannine kinds of symbolism and so forth, and Mark doesn't really go there. Then, okay, so the high priest and the entire Sanhedrin, notice that emphasis, Mark kind of brings that out a second time, sought witness in order to kill him. Now notice that they are seeking witnesses with the purpose of killing him. They have a purpose in mind. Okay, it's not simply to see if he's innocent or guilty or something like that. But what they're doing is looking for testimony in order to do him in. And this word witness, martyria, we get martyr from that in English. Mark uses this over and over again. In fact, exact phrase in verse 56, he says, there were many who bore witness against him. And then notice in 57 again, and some stood up and bore witness against him, saying, and so forth. So I'm sorry, not bore witness, bore false witness against him. So Mark is really emphasizing the falseness of their witness. And I think he mentions this word witness in one form or another like 4 times in these verses. So that's really coming down hard on the fact that this witnessing is false. Now the interesting thing is, think back to chapter 2 when they let the paralytic down through the roof, and the Pharisees there said, or the scribes, I forget whether the scribes or Pharisees as described, but anyway, whether when they said, who is this who forgives sins? Only the one God can forgive sins. Well, in the context of Mark, that's right.
Yeah.
The people who are on the wrong side say the right thing. And so the false witnesses, you see, they're going to say something which is false, because nowhere in the gospel does Jesus say, destroy this, I will destroy this temple made by hands, and through 3 days we'll build another not made by hands. But when we start looking at the meaning of those expressions and so forth, we realize that actually they're kind of speaking the truth. Jesus didn't say that. It's false witness about Jesus, but it's kind of truth about what's going on.
So it is Mark. Sorry, John.
Mark does this all the time. It's a book full of irony and full of these double entendres.
I was going to ask you, is it simply for irony's sake, and in that way underlining the importance of what Jesus has been accused of here, apparently?
Mm-hmm. Now, when we look at this, these words, okay, so to destroy this temple made by hands, whenever in the Septuagint, in the Greek version of the Old Testament, which was written translated a couple hundred years before Christ, anytime that we find the word made by hands, it always refers to an idol. So that's interesting. And at the same time, something not made by hands, that means not made by human hands. So it clearly would suggest something made by divine hands. And so if I will make something, make a temple not made by hands, not made by human hands, then I will make a temple made by divine hands. So who am I?
Okay. I see. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Okay. So that's what the false witnesses are saying. Now, there's a lot of discussion here. People say, well, what does this mean? And, how would Mark's original audience have understood this, and so on and so forth. And, I don't think it's legitimate to interpret this from a Johannine point of view. In John's gospel, Jesus says, destroy this temple and I will raise up another not made by hands, right? And Matthew and Luke, they don't have this made by hands, not made by hands contrast. That's unique to Mark. So what is Mark up to when he's talking about that? And it seems that when we research all of this stuff, that that Jesus is speaking about building God's house, God's real house, the house in the sky, if you will, and that the builder of the temple, as we see in Samuel and also in Exodus and so forth, the builder of the temple is a priest and a king and a prophet. And so Jesus is basically saying, I am the divine priest, king, prophet guy. and I am going to build God's real temple, not made by hands, the eternal one. And actually, this is surprisingly close to the vision that we see in Hebrews. I think it's chapter 9, if I'm not mistaken, chapter 7, if I am. But anyway, and there, Christ goes as high priest into the temple, more perfect tabernacle, not made by hands, and offers his own blood, and so forth. So that's kind of the picture here that we're talking about. Now, Jesus is identifying him. Well, I'll get to this in a second, but okay.
Can I ask John, the temple,
Yes.
the new temple that Jesus is building that's not of human hands,
Mhm.
is John's view of that it's Jesus himself, and is that something that you feel isn't?
In John, Jesus says explicitly right there, he was talking, well, John says about what Jesus just said, he was talking about his body. Now, in Paul, the new temple is the church. So a lot of people interpret Mark in a Pauline way, but I don't think that works. I think that Mark is actually more apocalyptic, if you're familiar with that term. It has a lot more to do with the kinds of it's not an apocalyptic book like the Book of Revelation or First Enoch or something like that, but it's similar in many ways, and kind of interested in some of the same ideas.
So the temple is something that God has created or is creating, which is distinct from any human edifice.
No. I suppose you could say, because anything that's not God is created, right? So the temple that he lives in the sky, the true temple, of which the one on earth is an image or a symbol, made according to the pattern which you saw on the holy mountain, as it says in Exodus. The temple in Jerusalem is a reflection of that eternal temple. But what Jesus is saying is I'm going to build the true temple. Okay. And that's the distinction between made by hands and not made by hands.
How do you account for the 3 days that comes up here?
The 3 days, I mean, first of all, it has roots in the Old Testament. God often rescues Israel on the third day or something like that. But also, of course, in the gospel, the 3 days is the resurrection.
We're not going to get to the meat of this passage if we don't move on a little bit. We're not going to cover everything. Can I just ask about Jesus's silence throughout the trial? I think one of our listeners had a question about that as well.
Yeah.
Why was Jesus silent? If he hadn't said anything at all, he'd never have been condemned. But why is he silent during this first bit, do you think?
Oh, I think they would have found a way to condemn him. But I think that if you notice, when Judas comes to give Christ a kiss and to hand him over to the authorities, in the other gospels, like in Luke, Jesus says, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? In Mark, Jesus says nothing. A false witness does not deserve an answer. Especially in a kangaroo court. A false disciple who comes, offering a false kiss doesn't deserve a response. And so Jesus is silent there also. And I think that's just kind of consistently how Mark understands Jesus. Jesus is the righteous one, and he's just not going to get into that argument because he's not going to win that argument. They're looking for a way to kill him.
Could it at the same time be a throwback to Isaiah 53 and that Jesus is being likened to the suffering servant?
Yeah, and there's that layer too. So he is dumb before his accusers and so forth. So, we could get into that background if we want, but then we wouldn't get finished. So, David, I think you're muted.
Does anyone want to say any more about that section, or can we move on to Jesus?
I think we better move on, David. I was going to mention something about Peter, but let's move on.
So what does Jesus mean by his answer to the high priest's question?
Well, the answer to the high priest question is it's extremely dense. Okay, first of all, I think many of our listeners and viewers will recognize that when Jesus says, well, first of all, before Jesus says anything, the high priest, finally, gets frustrated with all these false witnesses whose witness doesn't agree and so forth. And he finally, stands up in the middle. And that expression, if I'm not mistaken, is the same expression that appears in chapter 3, verses 1-6, where Jesus has the man with the withered hand stand in the middle. And then Jesus addresses the people. It is an expression which, in its exact form, is kind of unusual in the Old Testament, and it is used of Moses standing on Mount Sinai at the big revelation. So this is the big revelation. Okay, so he stands in the middle. And he turns to Jesus. Now, this is really interesting. Back in chapter 8, what is it, verse, I don't know, about 27 or something like that, Jesus says, who do people say I am? And, some say you're John the Baptist or whatever, but who do you say I am? He says to the disciples. And Peter pipes up and says, you're the Messiah.
Yeah.
The high priest here, when he turns to Jesus, he says exactly the same words in exactly the same order. The only difference is a question mark at the end. He says, you're the Messiah.
Oh, yeah.
And that's how it should be translated. Not, are you the Messiah? Because that's not, Peter didn't say, are you the Messiah? Peter said, you're the Messiah. But so now, you're the Messiah. But he adds, you're the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed. Now, there's been some research on this exact question. The Messiah, Son of the Blessed. So Son of the Blessed kind of acts as a modifier, as an adjective kind of thing for Messiah. So are you the kind of Messiah who is the Son of the Blessed One of God, as opposed to the kind of Messiah who is like the chief general, or the kind of Messiah that might be the high priest, or this kind of Messiah, that kind of, are you this kind of Messiah? So it's not just, it repeats Peter's exact expression, you're the Messiah. You're the Messiah? The one that's the Son of the Blessed?
What is the one and the son of the, what is the one who is the Son of the Blessed like?
Are you the divinely anointed priest king? Messiah means anointed. Okay. And let's point out it's priest king because he was just talking about, or Mark was just talking about, the temple not made by hands, right? You see, so we're still on the same topic here. Right. This is kind of tightly wrapped. Okay, so he says that, and then Jesus answers, and I think, as I started to say, most of our readers and hearers and viewers will probably recognize the first part of Jesus' answer when he says, I am. And that is, well, you could say, are you Jesus? I am. That's legitimate, but you can't read that, especially in this context, and not think of what is it, Exodus 3:15, I believe, the burning bush, where God says to Moses, his own name, I am.
Can I just pipe up, just in case there's another layer here, John? By using the phrase blessed one, is the high priest actually kind of not mentioning the name of God, because that's basically not allowed? You call him by a kind of euphemism, if you like. And then Jesus, in his answer, actually does say the name of God. So
although it's not forbidden to say those words,
right.
But so he doesn't say I am YHWH. I don't say that name out loud, but right. He doesn't say that, but he says what God said to Moses at the burning bush.
Right.
So we have to catch that. Now, am I right about that? Well, we find out, for example, in John's gospel, the minute Jesus says, they say, are you Jesus? And he says, I am. All of the soldiers, fall down as if dead, right?
Yeah.
It's the revelation, and so then they have to kind of restart the scene, and then the arrest and the trial and so forth proceed. But first of all, there's a revelation. Well, that revelation takes place here in Mark, and he says, "I am," and then he says, "And you will see." The Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming in glory. How does it go in the coming on the clouds of heaven? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the third of 3 times when Jesus talks about the Son of Man coming. So we have to talk about the Son of Man coming because it's very important. And Jesus says it 3 times. The first time, comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. That's in 8:38. In 13:26, he comes coming in the clouds with great power and glory, and then here sitting at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. So what is this all about? Well, it's a combination of at least 3 passages. The first one, the sitting, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. So, he'll be sitting at the right hand of power, right? Okay.
That's Psalm 2, yeah?
Psalm 110.
110.
Yeah. And related to Psalm 2, because Psalm 2 is an enthronement psalm. And let me proclaim the Lord's decree. He has said, thou art my son, today I've begotten you, and so forth. Okay. So there's that. There's the enthronement. Now, Psalm 110 is the enthronement of a priest king. You are a priest of the order of Melchizedek, a priest forever, and your enemies are a footstool for your feet, and so forth. Okay, so you have that. You have Daniel, and this is really important, Daniel 7:13. And then I saw one like a son of man coming on the clouds and presented to the Ancient of Days. Okay, well, what the scene in Daniel is Daniel has just seen all of these beasts, these terrible beasts rising from the sea of history, and each one worse than the other, and thrones are set up. The Ancient of Days comes and sits down, gives judgment, and the beasts are destroyed. And then one like a son of man comes on the clouds, because that's what you do when you're moving around in heaven, coming on clouds. But there, if he's a man, it's like a son of man, he's coming up to the Ancient of Days and receives power and dominion. In other words, is enthroned forever and ever as Lord of history in Daniel. All right. Well, notice there that it doesn't say anything about sitting, but we can assume it's implicit that he's enthroned because he becomes Lord and has eternal authority and so forth.
Right.
But there's a complication here, and I think this is actually very important in Mark, and it deserves a lot further study. We talked about it with R.B. Hayes when we had the episode about the Gethsemane thing, is that the Greek and the Hebrew differ quite significantly in this passage. In the Greek and the Aramaic, the Aramaic of Daniel says, I saw one like a son of man coming in the clouds and is presented to the Ancient of Days. But in the Greek, it says, I saw one coming in the clouds as the Ancient of Days. So the Son of Man is the Ancient of Days.
Yeah,
he's just coming in that thing, and I think that actually Mark is working with this, and I don't know that we'll have time to really talk about this, but I think this what's going on is that the Ancient of Days is somehow God. Now there's a distinction between God and the Son of Man. There's a distinction between the Father and the Son. There's a distinction in the Old Testament even between God and the Lord. Most people think the Lord is the Father, but he's not. All of the early Christians, all of them without exception, read the Lord in the Old Testament as being the pre-incarnate Christ, the pre-incarnate Son. So I think Mark is on the same page. But we need to keep that in mind as we read the rest of this. Okay, so you will see the Son of Man coming, sitting at the right hand of power. Okay, and coming on the clouds. All right, so the sequence seems wrong. He's sitting and then coming.
Yeah.
But the third passage that Mark is weaving together here is Zechariah 14:5, where the Lord comes with his holy ones, that is, with the angels, to rescue Israel. And so he comes and he stands on the Mount of Olives and so on and so forth. So you see the coming of God, and whenever we read about coming in the Old Testament, kind of in this context, it's always the coming of God to judge and above all to rescue Israel.
Right. Can I ask a question, John? Sorry, very quickly. So, forgive me if you were about to mention this. Why does it say that the high priest will see this?
Well, I think simply because he's condemning him. Let me just look something up. I don't remember the exact word, and I want to be sure that I am. Yeah, it is plural. Yeah, so it's not. He's not saying that the high priest. He's saying you all.
Ah, right.
Yeah, so you'll all see. Now, all right, you'll see the Son of Man. Basically, you'll see the Son of Man in glory. Now, this connects with a bunch of other places. Remember, in what is it, 8:38? Or no, I've said 9:1. There are some standing here who will not taste of death until they see.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
All right, and remember that James and John want to sit at his right and his left hand in his glory, and Jesus says, well, you don't know what you're asking. Are you able to be baptized and drink the cup with me? And they say we can. And Jesus says, you will, but to give the right and the left hand seats, it's not mine to give. Well, what's he talking about there? Who gives the right and the left to places on the right and the left to Jesus? It's the Roman soldiers. He's not in a position to appoint the right and the left hand because he's on the cross.
Oh,
but
wow.
what does that mean? That means that the cross is the moment of glory.
Yeah.
The cross is the moment of ascension, and this is kind of the punchline in Mark.
Mm.
You see, this is huge because everybody is thinking that the moment of glory is going to be this sort of like, I don't know, lightning from the heaven and all that stuff, and the moment of glory is the cross.
So, John, I've got a question about this passage. It's a bit odd. I haven't noticed it before until this evening, actually, as I was preparing. Why does it say the Son of Man is sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and then coming on the clouds of heaven? How can he be sitting and coming at the same time?
Well, those it's a timeline. He's first sitting and then he's coming.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's that simple. That confused me for a long time too, because, well, first of all, the sequence in Daniel 7:13 is that he's coming and then implicitly sitting. He's given a kingdom. He's enthroned. But it wasn't until a while back that I realized that Mark is actually weaving together Daniel 7:13, where he's coming on the clouds, and Zechariah 14:5, where the Lord is coming to rescue Israel and to destroy her enemies. And so now what's interesting there is that Mark is weaving together passages which seem to say kind of the opposite thing. So but in sort of the rules of ancient rhetoric, we prefer to keep our metaphor. We don't like mixed metaphors, but in the ancient world, they liked mixed metaphors. It just kind of enriched the soup, and so I think this would be a case of that. Now, one thing I wanted to draw attention to was when Jesus says, I am, and you will see, etc. Okay. When will you see? Because everybody thinks of this as Jesus is talking about the second coming, and he is in a way, okay? But in another way, remember that Mark was the first gospel written. Matthew is Mark's first commentator, and Luke is Mark's second commentator. So that's pretty good if you write a book and then the two gospels are like your commentators, right? And so that gives you an idea of the importance of Mark. But a lot of times Matthew and Luke will add a word or clarify something in Mark, or take out something just sort of to make the scene more clear, or they have their own kind of theological interests that they're working with. But in the corresponding scene in Matthew and Luke, both of them add a word or a phrase that that does something really interesting. Jesus says, "I am," and in Matthew, "from now on, aparti, you will see." And in Luke, it says, "From this now, ektunin, you will see." So that shows that Matthew and Luke understood Mark, Mark's story here of what Jesus says, understood it very particularly. Jesus was not talking about some distant future coming of the Son of Man. He's talking about the glorification of the Son of Man will be when will you see all this? You'll see it on the cross. And that's kind of the punchline of Mark's gospel, and I think really of all the gospels, is that the glorification of the Son of Man is the cross. It's not kind of what everybody is thinking. There's going to be the sort of good cop, bad cop. Jesus is the nice guy now. He goes around forgiving sins and healing people. But when he comes back, he's going to smash heads and destroy nations and on and on and on. No, there isn't a good cop, bad cop. There's only one Jesus, and the glory of Jesus is the cross, and that's the final judgment.
Wow.
The early fathers say that the cross is the scales, on which the world hangs. That's the judgment, that's the forgiveness, that's the love of God, and I think we need to really, in the light of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, revise some of our ideas about the second coming and so forth. Now, it's not about the second coming also. But okay, so now that we're clear about that, I want to say, if the Son of Man is a priest of the heavenly sanctuary, okay, so we're talking about the temple not made by hands, right?
Yep.
So if he's being exalted, as in Daniel, and so forth, as in Psalm 110, if he's being exalted to God's right hand, then his sitting would provide his sitting or his enthronement and so forth in the heavenly temple, in the heavenly sanctuary, would provide an alternate and more real kind of access to God than is available in the temple in Jerusalem. Okay, that's exactly the point in Hebrews, isn't it? He takes with himself not the blood of goats and bulls, and not into the earthly made by hand sanctuary, but his own blood into the beyond the veil, into the heavenly sanctuary. Okay, and so a cultus or a liturgical worship surrounding the Messiah, Son of the Blessed, would supersede the one in the Jerusalem temple. Okay. Now, what is the charge that they nail Jesus on right after he says this? What does the high priest say?
It's blasphemy.
Yeah, he calls it blasphemy. Now, do you remember back in chapter 2? We just talked about this. Back in chapter 2. Who is this? He blasphemes. Only the one God can forgive sins. It's exactly the same charge. But the charge there was of usurping God's prerogatives. And the charge here is of usurping God's prerogatives, of claiming to be the Lord, the Son of God, and therefore providing, the Son of God, 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 providing, the Son the true worship. Okay. Anyway, so the same point is made in Hebrews. It's also, you find it in Stephen's speech in Acts. You find it elsewhere in Paul and so forth. So that's what I wanted to say. That kind of the focus of this whole episode is on the identity of Christ as the Lord Himself, as the divine priest king enthroned in the true temple, not made by hands, the one through whom we have access to God, His Father, and so forth.
Really, really helpful. Thank you, John. I kind of want to stop there, but I have one. I'd like to get a question in from a listener, which is this: the last verse, verse 65. They condemned him as worthy of death. Some began to spit on him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophesy." And the guards took him and beat him. Why did they beat him? I don't remember, Anne says, ever seeing anything in Old Testament law to suggest someone condemned to death should be beaten up first. Was that common, that those condemned by the Sanhedrin were beaten? Was this the influence of Roman violence on their society, or is it just an expression of human hatred?
Well, remember, this whole thing is a kangaroo court, and they're looking for a way to kill him and so forth.
Yeah.
I thoroughly agree with people like Kenneth Bailey and Molina and Pilch and people like that. This is basically what they call a status degradation ritual. He is snubbed and thumbed his nose at and challenged the authority of the authorities and so forth.
Yeah.
What they've got to do is now take him down a bunch of notches, and the seriousness of the snub will dictate the seriousness of the takedown.
Right, I get you.
So yeah,
is there something in the word prophesy that's quite significant as well? Because they're asking him to prophesy, i.e., I assume, tell them who's just hit him. But actually, Jesus has been prophesying very accurately all the way through the Passion and before that, to say that these things will be happening, suggesting despite everything, God is in control.
Yeah, and that's interesting in the light of his refusal to answer the high priest and his silence before Pilate, which is coming up. That prophecy, he uses that to announce what God's will, God's intention, God's plan, what God is doing, and so forth. He uses prophecy to announce, but he doesn't use it to condemn. He doesn't use it particularly to accuse. At least this is sort of my thinking about that. So yeah, he could you have the impression, he knows what's going on ahead of time. He says, go into the city across from you, you'll find a colt tied up, etc. And they find it just as he said. And the same with the guy carrying the jar, for preparing the Passover. So we have immediately we have had all these stories of Jesus prophesying. So you have the feeling he perfectly well could say, "Oh, your name is is whatever, and you just hit me on the right cheek or whatever." But he doesn't do that. He leaves sort of their future open.
Yeah. Thank you. Does either of you have one last thing you'd like to say? We're running out.
Well, I just wanted to point out that, okay, so then how does the scene end? Well, okay, as Stefan said, Jesus is then handed over to the chief priests begin to strike him and so forth. I think you might have forgotten to let me share screen again. So if you could put that up,
yeah.
I'll do that.
Yeah.
Okay, so and where is it? Okay, there we are. All right, so if you're looking at my screen, you see that, okay, Jesus has made this announcement of who he is in the middle, You've got the high priest, his question and his demand for a verdict on either side of that. And then you've got the council members and false witnesses are, testifying. And here the council members and false witnesses are beating him. Okay. And then you have the, on either side of that, it's sort of bookending that, you have the attendants who are sitting by the light, along with Peter, and here now the attendants receive him. And then bookending that, you have Peter. And it's interesting, this whole thing is sort of bookended with inside this story of Peter, who first follows at a distance. Remember, Peter was going to, follow him wherever he went, be faithful unto death, and so on and so forth. Well, then Peter denies, and it's the bookends. And that's very significant, and it will come up again in the final scene of the gospel, where the guy inside the tomb says to the women, tell the disciples and Peter, he's leading you in Galilee and you'll see him there. So there's a reconciliation there. And then, of course, you have, the Jewish leaders assemble in order to give judgment. And then finally, bookending, you have the Jewish leaders assemble in order to take him to Pilate, just as he was brought to the high priest at the beginning. So you see, once again, the structure. I want to point that out because the structure in Mark is so often, actually in all of the scriptures, is so often a means of getting at the meaning of the story. And we tend to read the scripture just as kind of, a flat series, just a pile of paragraphs that have no connection with each other, but they're connected. It's just not in the way that we are used to in the way we do writing nowadays. So have to learn that.
That's a great way to finish, John. Thank you. To look at the symmetry again and we'll continue with the next bit, because we haven't, this bit particular, the bit today we've looked at isn't symmetrical, but it's all part of the whole Passion sequence. John Burnett and Stephen Smart, thank you so much for taking your time to share your thoughts with us. It's been a real treat to be involved in the conversation, or at least to be listening to it. We've enjoyed having you with us too, lovely listener. And we hope you'll check out the website iam-mark.com and the Facebook community, as well as John's Gospel of Mark workshop and his charity, the St. Nicholas Africa Fund. That's all we have time for today. We've run into the buffers. So it's goodbye from John Burnett.
May I just put in one word about Gospel of Mark workshop.com.
Yeah, we'll put it in the notes.
And let me get this here for you so you can see it. I think. Anyway, it doesn't look like the screen is going to cooperate with me, so we'll just forget about that. But no, there it is. Sorry. Gospel of Mark workshop.com. And then the St. Nicholas Africa Fund.org. Please contribute generously. And if you're interested in more of what I've given you, you can contact me at the other one.
That's where to find it. Thank you so much, both of you. It's been an absolute delight. And we're grateful to the members of Question Mark group on Facebook who managed to get a question in right at the end. If you're not already involved and would like to be, do get involved. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode of Question Mark and don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to click on the subscribe button. This also means other people can find the podcast and join the conversation too. We'd also love if you could leave a review so we know what was good and what we can improve for future episodes. If you want to find out more about I Am Mark, Stephen Smart's solo word-for-word dramatisation of Mark's Gospel, go to www.sleek.bio/IamMark, where you can sign up for free for his newsletter and a whole host of other goodies. Join us and our special guests next time, where we'll continue to explore the greatest story ever told together. If you want to get involved with the podcast or have any questions or comments in the meantime, please do get in touch using the I Am Mark social media channels. We'd love to hear from you.
We light it up, we won't come down. And the the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.